Hello and welcome to Inside the Americas. I'm Delano D'Souza. Coming up on the show this week. Ukraine's president demands the UN Security Council hold Russia accountable for war crimes. Volodymyr Zelensky says failure to do so should result in the body being dissolved. While the US announced the end to Title 42 at the Mexico border, Russians looking to enter the United States said the legislation is being used to keep them out. And a curfew lifted in Peru's capital, Lima. It was put in place by the president to calm protests over the rising costs of fuel and fertilizer. But first, Ukraine's president addressed the UN Security Council on Tuesday. Volodymyr Zelensky's first address to the body since Russia's invasion began called for accountability. His plea came following the discoveries of civilian victims in the town of Bucha. Killings, Zelensky says, are tantamount to attempted genocide and war crimes committed by Russia.
Hold Moscow accountable for war crimes. That's what the Ukrainian president demanded on Tuesday. Appearing via video link to the United Nations Security Council, he aired graphic footage from alleged Russian killings of civilians in Bucha and gave harrowing details of atrocities.
This is no different from other terrorists, such as the Islamic State group who occupied some territories. And here it is done by a member of the United Nations Security Council. The Russian military and those who gave them orders must be brought to justice immediately for war crimes in Ukraine.
Washington, meanwhile, reiterated its appeal to the UNSC, seeking Russia's expulsion from the UN Human Rights Council, saying its participation hurts the Council's credibility.
Every day we see more and more how little Russia respects human rights. Given the growing mountain of evidence, Russia should not have a position of authority in a body whose very purpose is to promote respect for human rights.
Defending itself, the Kremlin called the Bucha images a forgery and dismissed Kiev's reports of mass deportations, saying 600,000 people had been willingly evacuated to Russia.
Today, we've heard once again a huge amount of lies about Russian soldiers and military. We're not talking about any kind of coercion or abduction, as our Western partners like to think, but rather the voluntary decision by these people, and testified by many videos on social media.
The UN said Tuesday over 4 million Ukrainians have fled the country since Russia's invasion. A further 7 million said to be internally displaced, with as many as 20,000 killed so far.
Now, more and more people from Ukraine and Russia are traveling to Tijuana, Mexico to ask for asylum in the United States. The first few were able to cross the border without great difficulty, but are now being pushed back due to Title 42. It's a piece of legislation that enables the U.S. to automatically deport people when they come from a country where COVID-19 is circulating widely. Russians are now among the many would-be refugees trapped in Tijuana, unable to seek asylum. France 24's team on the ground filed this report.
San Isidro is the busiest border crossing in the world. Ukrainians or Russians are among the many travelers who arrived recently in Mexico and are now seeking refuge in the United States. Volodymyr and his family left Ukraine on February 24th, the first day of the war. The family rushed out of Ukraine and then traveled for 20 days, crossing 8 European countries.
It was not easy, because we cry, and in our city too rozbombili aeroporty.
This war has already pushed more than 3 million Ukrainians into exile, mainly to neighboring countries. But for some of them, reaching Mexico and then the United States sounded like a safer option. Anastasia joined her American husband here. She left her city, Kharkiv, just before the start of the Russian offensive.
My house already was bombed. My grandmother's house was already bombed.
You lost your uncle?
Yeah, my uncle died. The Russians shoot him.
After a few hours of waiting, the American guards allow them into the United States. Most asylum seekers will not be so lucky. Nastya, Artem and their son have just arrived from Russia.
seeking political asylum in USA. We are Protestant and we work American Church in Russia. We are oppressed and considered American Western agents.
They are not allowed to cross the border because of Title 42. This provision of American law prevents migrants from filing asylum applications on American soil. The law was adopted 2 years ago as a protective measure against COVID-19. More and more Russians find themselves stranded in Tijuana. This is the case of Agata and her family. They arrived in Mexico 2 weeks ago. Close to opposition leader Alexei Navalny, the family chose to leave the country when repression turned tougher.
Сейчас, после начала войны в Украине, с Украины
After the start of the war in Ukraine, the political situation in Russia deteriorated. Right after we left Russia, Putin signed a law punishing people who call this conflict a war with up to 15 years in prison.
Migrant aid associations continue to denounce the injustice of Title 42.
It endangers people's lives and it denies them their right to benefit from international protection. Here along the border, we have thousands of families in such dangerous cities as Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez and Reynosa, where they are at risk. Mexico is not a safe third country.
Since its implementation under Donald Trump, Title 42 has reportedly blocked nearly 1 million people at the border between Mexico and the United States.
A curfew in Peru's capital was lifted on Tuesday. People took to the streets despite the order. The curfew was put in place by the country's president. Authorities in Peru have been scrambling to calm protests which have broken out due to the rising costs of fuel and fertilizer triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
An end to the curfew in Lima, less than a day after it was declared. Peruvian President Pedro Castillo backtracked on Tuesday after more than 1,000 people turned out in the capital, ignoring the order.
We're moving to the office to sign and lift this curfew. Peru isn't going through a good time, but it's up to the powers of the state to solve it.
Castillo imposed the stay-at-home order in Lima just before midnight on Monday in response to protests over soaring fuel and food prices. It took many by surprise, as most demonstrations, some of which turned violent, took place far from the capital.
We are coming out peacefully to protest against Castillo, to tell him to go.
Last night's measure seems excessive to me. The time has come when you have to complain to make the government stop.
We want freedom to work, to study, to be in the streets. We've already gone through the pandemic. Now there's this unconstitutional curfew.
The opposition also denounced the curfew as illegal.
They take away our freedom, and on top of that they repress us. It's a delinquent government, full of corruption.
President of Congress, Maria del Carmen Alva, praised the protesters for forcing the government to backtrack. The demonstrations began last week as emerging economies like Peru began to feel the knock-on effects of Western sanctions on Russia over its war in Ukraine. The country was already facing a 26-year high in inflation. It's now seen its oil and fertilizer supplies cut off. The embattled President Castillo has attempted to appease protesters by scrapping a fuel tax and raising the minimum wage by 10%. It's a latest test for Castillo, who's already survived 2 impeachment attempts after just 8 months in office.
Former US President Barack Obama was back in the White House this week, albeit for a few hours. He was back to a place he knows well to celebrate the 12th anniversary of his signature healthcare law, the Affordable Care Act. The legislation, also known as Obamacare, has survived despite repeated attempts by Republicans to gut it. Here's a look at the former president and the current occupant of the White House reunited.
Vice President Biden, Vice President. That was a joke. That was all set up. My president, Joe Biden.
My name is Joe Biden. I'm Barack Obama's vice president. And I'm Jill Biden's husband.
Now, not far from the White House is Capitol Hill, and it's got a fox problem. A fox recently lunged at a congressman from California. Capitol Hill police has warned of numerous fox encounters, adding the animals should not be approached.
Foxtrotting onto the US crime scene, he quickly became the most wanted canine in Washington. In this candid footage, the suspect lurks around Capitol Hill, close to the Senate and the House of Representatives, waiting to pounce on Congressman Amy Berra.
I felt something lunge at me from behind. Thought it was probably a small dog or something, but really pivoted and jumped. I had my umbrella in hand, thinking that I'd have to shoo a dog away. And it's like, that's not a dog, that's a fox.
The Democrat politician was just one of around a dozen victims left in the fox's wake. This woman also fell prey to his tricks. The animal's bite can be a serious injury and in some cases can pass on rabies. After a fox hunt that lasted several hours, local police were finally able to close in on the cunning creature.
Now what happens? I got him! You know, a lot of folks have been asking, is this the one and only fox? We hope it's the one and only fox, but there are other traps in the area, so if there are other foxes, hopefully they will handle that.
It's an unusual tale. Though urban foxes are present in some US cities, this kind of aggressive behavior is rare.
That's it for this edition of Inside the Americas. From all of us on the team, thank you very much for watching.
Join us every day here on France 24 for the last stretch of the presidential race, the mother of all election, the presidential election. This is the time for the French to choose their president. We'll have all our special envoys on the campaign trail across the globe, the latest analysis, the best polls. Join us here on France 24.
France 2022, the campaign on France 24 and France24.com.